In video 17, we did all the strategic editing on a seascape using mostly linear gradients, but we did use the brush briefly too. Now what we have here is a completely different subject, but it uses the same techniques. Now, not only is this typical of our image editing, but it's also a positive thing too. Most of us don't mind spending a bit of time learning a technique that we're going to use most of the time, and it'll finally become a routine. All the editing that I want to do has been done in the light, colour and effects. You will notice, if you look down at the effects here, that because of the nature of the texture of the animal, I have increased the texture slider there just a little bit. It just makes a little more of the scales on the animal. So let me make a start by going to the masks, and I'm going to select my linear gradient. Click and drag up that log. You can notice that it's encroaching a little bit into the animal's claws. I don't think that's going to be a problem. Remember, as we move the sliders, the overlay will disappear. I'm going to take the highlights way down, not doing a massive amount, but I know this will. So I'm going to take that down pretty low. Now what that's doing is to throw up more interest into the face of the animal, because we're not distracted or taken to the bottom of the screen. But now, of course, it does show up the top of the screen that little bit more. So I'm going to go to my little white cross here, select another gradient, click and drag. This time I'll allow it to drift over the face, because the face could do with a little bit of darkening also. So once again, let's drop the highlights down. Going to drop the exposure on the background, throw some light into the animal's face. Now, as soon as I do that, if we look over to the left-hand side, it shows the left-hand side is now weak. It looked okay originally, but of course, it doesn't matter how many masks we use. Now, let's go back and select the linear gradient again. You can see now why shortcuts like the G key can be so useful. Here, I'm going to click and drag and just drop that exposure. And I think I'm happy with that for the moment. What I want to do next is to see what I can do with the animal's head. So before we select any tools, let's click and drag. Let's hold the space bar, get it nicely positioned, ready for our work. And now we can choose the tool we want to use. I'm going to use the brush here, so I'm going to select it. There's the option that I want. Now I suppose there's two ways that we can use the brush. What we could do first of all is to mask all the area of the head that we want to see darken. So that would include all the area on the top and around, but we're never quite sure exactly how much we want. The other way we can use the mask, and this is what I tend to do, is I look at the image and I think, well, what does it need? Well, it needs those highlights taking down. But of course, we've not masked it yet, so we can't see the effect of what I'm changing here. But believe me, you'll soon get a feel for this. And of course, the fail-safe is, even if you get it wrong, you can change it. I'm also going to drop down the exposure a little bit. So what I've done here is to input the changes to the image before I've even masked to see them. So now with my brush selected, if you look up at the flow, you can see the flow is about 28. Maybe I'll drop that down just a little bit. But now I can start to brush over this area. Remember, we can change the size of the brush if we need to. And we can start to see the tones in the animal change. And now you can see why I like to do the changes over on the right before I make the masking changes, because I find I can see the effect and I can decide just how much of it I'm going to accept. It's still darkening those light areas, so I've still got some way to go if I want to continue. But you can see it's pretty quick and easy to do. Now while we've got our brushed mask head on, let's select another one. Because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lighten the eye here. So what I'm going to do is push up the shadows and I'm going to push up the exposure. You notice I pushed the shadows quite a long way because they're quite dark here. Keeping the settings around 20-25 over on the right, the flow. I'm just going to, beg your pardon, I just hit the wrong key there. I was just going to make my brush slightly smaller and I touched the wrong key. But here I can just brush over this area and I can just lift the eye. Now you'll notice the eye is very blue here. I wonder if I can just go to the temperature and move it to the right and just take some of that blueness away. And what it actually does as well is it enhances the area around the eye a little bit, and that's not a bad thing. Now just for a moment I'm going to hit Ctrl+0, the shortcut keystroke which will fit an enlarged image back onto the screen. But just before I do, we've got the image quite large, not very large, but you can also see that there's noise in the background. But let's hit that Ctrl+0. Now I'm going to select another brush mask. I'm going to go back to that little white cross and I'll do it the selection way rather than use shortcut keys. What I'm going to do is to just darken selected parts of the image. Now I've got a section down here and one up there, mostly they're light, so I'm going to take the highlights down and the exposure down. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and I'm just going to darken this area here just because it is showing up a little bit. I overspilled a little bit there and really we need to be a bit more careful than I've been, but I'm making a video so I do have an excuse. Down here, make a bigger brush and we can go over that light area also. I'm going to hit Ctrl+0 because I think it's probably better if we see this image full screen, and there's one or two areas which I think would benefit from just a little work. We've got a few highlights here maybe, and we can use the one tool to do a little bit of work around these areas, assuming you feel they need it, of course. This is all very, very personal, of course. Now I did go over the edge there just a little bit, didn't I? And that's really unforgivable to see that little area of shading there. I don't mind too much over here. In fact, I can help that along by drifting that shading in a little bit more. But what I can do now is I can go to subtract, and I can use a brush to subtract from my previous brush. Sounds complicated, but it really isn't. I'm going to make my brush quite small, and if I did overspill and I made a little mark that I couldn't live with, I can go back in and just do a little bit of work to correct it. And finally, although it's not the subject of this video at all, we're going to take a look at the noise. So I'm going to bring the image up to around about 150%. What I'm going to do is to apply the noise. We've dealt with this in a previous video, so I'm not going to go through that here, and I'll show you the result in a couple of seconds. Now with that noise complete, you can see it looks pretty good. Let me just move the animal over so you can see the eye, which remains beautifully sharp. I'm going to hit Ctrl+0. One final thing. When we look at our images and we save them as thumbnails in Bridge, it's not uncommon to look back a little bit later and wonder why we didn't see a little problem. Here I've got quite a dark underside to the animal. Maybe I could put a bit more light into the claws there. So once again, it's pretty simple. Let's go and pick up another mask. We can have as many of these as we feel we need. Let's go to the brush once again. Let me go to the animals under the head first, the throat area. Now that's dark, so I'm going to increase the shadows or open the shadows up a little bit of exposure. Bring my brush up, and now I can bring a bit of detail through here. So we've got a bit of sparkle into the scales below the animal's chin, maybe a little bit on the chin as well. coming down to the claws, we can make the image as big as we need, and we can just bring a little bit of light into those. Now I'm working what I call very quick and dirty for the sake of the length of this video. We would bring this up much bigger and we can actually work a lot finer, but even that doesn't take very long at all. Now you can probably tell that I'm a real fanny fusspot over image editing, and even now that light area down at the bottom is still bothering me. Rather than searching back and trying to adjust a mask that I may have used in other areas, I'll just create another one. I'll drop down exposure quite a bit this time, and I'll just brush over that just to make sure it's not going to annoy me. Let's go back to our basic tab, and there we have the image complete. Now, because I can easily turn my mask off in Adobe Camera Raw using those little eyes in the mask window, I can show you the image with just its global editing, but then I can show it with the strategic editing too. Now here I think we have a pretty good example of why masks for strategic editing are not only necessary but also essential to take your images to the next level, to get the very best from them, because photography is an art. I'll see you in the next video.